This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision session for Paper 1 Social Influence with a specific focus on minority influence. So to get started, first of all, knowing the specification is crucial if you want to do well in the subject. So the topic we are focusing on today is minority influence, and that is the last but one bullet point in the social influence specification. You will see the specification cites reference to consistency, commitment and flexibility. And then directly underneath that bullet point, there is the role of social influence processes in social change. So it's really important that you understand that minority influence is different to what I am about to highlight in red, which is conformity. Minority influence is not the same as normative social influence or informational social influence. The ones in red are examples of majority influence, whereas the exam board and the specification want you to understand how can a small group of people change the view of a large group of people. So that's the difference between minority and majority. A minority is a small group of people, whereas a majority is a large group of people. And we'll examine that concept in a little bit more detail when we get to the evaluation part of this section. So to begin, what is minority influence? Well, it is a form of social influence, but it is when a persuasive minority, so a small group of people, can change the attitudes and behaviours of the large group of people, the majority. Social change is then when a whole society adopts a new belief or way of behaving, which then becomes widely accepted as the norm. And so the two are quite closely linked. If you look at my images below, you'll see I've used the example of the suffragettes gaining votes for women. They were initially a minority, a small group of women with less power than the majority, who then campaigned and paved the way through minority influence to social change. So often what you do see is that minority influence does then lead to social change. And that's why it's important to know the difference between the two. So with minority influence, I've got 3 examples here. This is an opportunity for you to pause the video to think about these 3 individuals and the 3 questions above. In 5 seconds, I will start to talk through the answers. So on the left, this is an image of Rosa Parks. In the middle, you've got Martin Luther King, and then on the right, you've got Nelson Mandela. All 3 are examples of minorities that created social change. And that is ultimately the reason they are famous. But if you did think about those questions, you might have also come up with reasons of sort of the element of risk that they posed to themselves. So Rosa Parks willing to get arrested, Martin Luther King organising all sorts of marches, etc. Nelson Mandela actually imprisoned. So they've made a lot of risk, or they made a lot of risk to ensure that social change occurred. And all 3 started as a minority view, a small group of people or just one person that has then led the way for others to believe the same things that they do or act in the same way that they do. The characteristics that they share are crucial. They are consistent, committed and flexible. They are the 3 characteristics which are on the specification that you need to know, because they are the 3 ways minority influence, the 3 ways that minority influence occurs, essentially. So if we look in greater detail at what those definitions are, and you might want to pause the video to get down these definitions, because they are named on the spec, you could be asked to define them, but most importantly, you would expect to use them in an essay on minority influence, because they are the 3 core principles. So the first one is consistency. In this, minority must be stable in their opinion over time. Members of that group must all have an agreement as well. So they must be consistent over time, but also consistent within themselves. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key terms here for consistency. So stable is a key term, and then sort of over time to get that element of what consistency is across to the examiner without relying on the word consistency. So commitment is then a minority must be dedicated to their cause. So dedicated is crucial in your definition of commitment. The greater the dedication, the greater the influence. And this links to some of the information you will learn in social change. And that is that minorities might engage in extreme activities to demonstrate how committed they are, but also to draw attention, which is one of the processes of social change. Draw attention to their cause. The risk they take demonstrates their commitment and can increase the amount of interest from others. And again, this is a process in social change known as the augmentation principle. However, I have underlined draw attention and augmentation principles because they do overlap, and you would get credited for them if you use them in a question on minority influence. And then finally, flexibility. Now this links to consistency. So it's a bit of a middle ground for flexibility. So the minority need to be consistent, but they must also show a willingness to compromise. And compromise is that key term there to show the examiner you understand what flexibility is. So they need to show compromise when expressing their opinions and not be too rigid. So there must be room to maneuver and room to reason with the minority group. They can't just expect sort of everything that they are arguing for to be followed to the T and to be taken on board straight away by everyone in the same way. So flexibility is another key principle here. So just to sort of summarise, the role of consistency, commitment and flexibility are really important because they make people think about the topic that the minority are trying to be heard on. Over time, people will become converted and can switch from that minority view to the majority. So that idea of the suffragettes campaigning for women to have the vote, that was a very small group that believed that should happen. But through the consistency, commitment and flexibility of the suffragette movement, women gained the right to vote. And that can be said the same for with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement and the rights for black people. So the snowball effect, again, I've underlined because that is a process of social change, but it is also linked to minority influence because remember, the two are connected. You need a small group to make that change, to have that minority influence that can then become accepted as a social norm. And the way it is done is through the snowball effect, with more and more people getting on board, and gradually that minority view becomes the majority view and social change occurs. Looking into research into minority influence, Moscovici in 1969 is the key study you will need to know. So I'm about to go through the aim, procedure, findings and conclusion of the Moscovici study for minority influence. Moscovici is linked to either consistency, commitment or flexibility. And this is your opportunity now to pause the video and jot down anything you remember about the Moscovici study. There are full hints on screen for you, and in 5 seconds I will go through it. So, Moscovici's study is linked to consistency. Moscovici wanted to investigate if a consistent minority could influence a majority to give an incorrect answer in a colour perception task. So Moscovici used 172 female American participants, and they were told they were taking part in an experiment on colour perception. 6 participants at a time were asked to estimate a colour out loud of 36 slides. So they were all different shades of blue. 2 of the 6 participants were Confederates. So that's probably not worded the best. In your notes, I would sort of make clear there were 4 genuine participants and 2 Confederates in each group. There were two conditions. The consistent condition, where the two Confederates would call the slides green on all of the trials. So that incorrect answer there, because the slides are actually blue. And then the inconsistent condition, where the two Confederates called the slides green 24 times, but blue 12 times. Moscovici found that participants in the consistent condition were influenced by the minority, and they called the slides green on 8.4% of the trials. You can just round that down to 8% in the exam if you feel like you're going to lose track of all the numbers you have to revise. And then participants in the inconsistent condition only called the slides green in 1.3% of the trials. So a clear difference there. Again, you can round that down to 1%. So a clear difference of 7% with the element of consistency. So you can use this study as research support for minority influence, depending on the wording of the question. And you can also use it as AO1 to explain the role of consistency in minority influence. Moving on to another key study for minority influence, that is that by Nemeth in 1986. Nemeth wanted to investigate whether a flexible minority could influence a majority to give less compensation to a victim of a ski lift incident. So this is your opportunity to pause the video now, have a think about what the procedure and findings were in this study, and I'll go through it in 5 seconds. So participants were placed into groups of 4, and they had to agree on the amount of compensation they were going to give a victim of a ski lift accident. So one of the participants in each group was a Confederate, and there were 2 different conditions. Condition 1 was when the minority argued for a low rate of compensation and refused to change its position. So they were very inflexible, they were very rigid. And then the second condition was when the minority argued for a low rate of compensation, but compromised and offered a slightly higher rate of compensation. So they were flexible and had some room for manoeuvre. Nemeth found that in the inflexible condition, the minority had little or no effect on the majority, but in the flexible condition, the majority were much more likely to compromise and change their view. So Nemeth's study demonstrates the role of flexibility in minority influence, and therefore you've got 2 research support points: Moscovici supporting the role of consistency and Nemeth supporting the role of flexibility. This is your final opportunity now to pause the video and think about how would you develop these research support PO paragraphs, and using the other 2 pointers on screen, how do you think you could evaluate the research into minority influence? How could you evaluate Moscovici's study? How could you evaluate Nemeth's study? How could you evaluate sort of the concept of minority influence in terms of the way it's been investigated by psychologists? So pause the video, 5 seconds time, we will look at these evaluation points in more detail. So the methodological issues, hopefully you've identified the artificial nature of the tasks, deciding what colour some slides are, whether they're green or blue. Nothing like real life, nothing like the minority influence that we've discussed previously in the video, like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela, the suffragettes. Absolutely no real life sort of complexity in those tasks. Therefore, those studies do not capture the real commitment that minorities have to show towards their cause. And the findings massively lack external validity, but ecological validity if you want to be specific there. Therefore, it has a limited real-world application, which links nicely into the final evaluation point of limited real-world application. And by that, we mean this concept of minority influence, it has limited real-world application because there's a lot more involved in minority influence than just numbers. It is oversimplistic to just suggest that majority have more numbers, have more people that agree on a view. Minorities, like Rosa Parks, like Nelson Mandela, and like Martin Luther King, are minorities because of the way society is structured, and the same can be said for the suffragettes, women, and a patriarchal society. So majorities usually have a lot more power, status, and money than minorities. Minorities are very committed to their cause, and that's because they have to be, because they face very hostile, very ingrained opposition from society, from government, from politicians, etc. So it is far too much of a simplistic view for the research to just suggest that minority influence and majority influence, the difference is simply numerical. So those are the 3 evaluation points that you could use for an essay on research into minority influence. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it useful.